Hi, I'm Jane Hoffer, the CEO of GoWithFlow. I am so delighted to be here today to share my passion and my hopes to inspire you for change related to sustainable mobility. The premise is that changing transportation in companies and communities is good for the environment, right? The International Energy Agency says that emissions from transport, now we're talking primarily about road, rail, air and marine transportation, accounts for nearly 1/4, 24%, of global CO2 emissions. Well, let's drill it down another level. Just take commuting from work. Some refer to it as corporate mobility. According to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the WBCSD, about 30% of the 6.7 billion vehicle miles traveled globally is by commuters. Even if you were to just target commuting and make those miles zero emission, it would remove about 880,000 tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And we all saw it, real time, when the world stopped driving and flying during the early days of the pandemic. But it's not just air pollution that comes from transportation. Moving people and things costs a lot of money. Last year, in the United States alone, transportation of goods accounted for more than $1 trillion. But who bears the burden of this expense? Everyone, from the raw material suppliers to the makers, to the service and delivery providers, and ultimately to the consumer or user of the good or service. Imagine if we could lower the total cost of transportation in a sustainable way and impact the entire value chain. Let's start with a relatively simple example, a services company. The transportation-intensive area of this business is centered around people, commuting to and from the business, or between the offices, or to their customers. Now granted, during the pandemic again, this type of travel has been reduced, but it isn't gone. And it will return in a new normal in the future. Sales-related travel, part of that, is a direct cost of revenue. Intra-company travel is an operating expense. Commuting expense is an operating expense if vehicles are offered through an employee fleet. Now that's common here in Portugal and Europe, not so much in the US. But often the expense is borne by the employee and felt in their wallet. And commute time and cost are often cited as the reasons for leaving a company. So we've just uncovered another operating expense, perhaps hidden, of recruiting and replacement to address this. Now, the opportunity to reduce costs in this scenario through public transportation, active transportation, such as e-bikes or scooters, or shared services such as carpooling and car sharing is substantial. Now, let's look at a larger organization with multiple offices and a manufacturing plant. Well, now you're adding in travel between headquarters and other locations, inter-facility transportation. You're adding in supplier transport costs, distribution costs, delivery cost. The fact is, mobility is extremely complex, even in the simplest companies. Transportation costs impact gross margin as well as operating costs, and ultimately they impact net profits. So, if you could find a way to both save money in transportation and lower greenhouse gas emissions, you'd do it, right? With all of that opportunity for change, what is the problem with going electric? Why not just transition your fleet of vehicles to EVs? Well, there are some pretty big assumptions about reasons not to implement electric vehicles, or at least not now. How many times have we heard someone say, "Oh, I love EVs, but my next car will be electric"? Or fleet managers say, "EVs are coming, yep, for sure, but they're just not ready for us yet." Well, we need to talk about some of these myths, shall we? First, electric vehicles are more expensive than traditional vehicles. But are they really? Let me give you one small example. There are more than 4,500 electric vehicles being managed in the GoWithFlow network today. Over the past 12 months, operators have seen an average cost savings of more than €225 per vehicle. Cost savings, total cost of ownership. While the difference in lease costs may favor traditional vehicles initially, the fuel and maintenance costs are significantly lower for EVs. UK insurer Direct Line released a study recently that calculated the average running cost of EVs compared to gas or diesel-powered vehicles. It found that annually, an EV cost about £1,742, or about $2,250. That's 21% cheaper than the average cost of an old-fashioned diesel or gasoline car, which was almost $2,900. Now, if you extrapolate that out over a fleet of, say, 300 vehicles, you've saved almost $200,000 just in basic operating costs. Now, myth number 2. The second myth is that EVs just aren't realistic. People seem to think that the battery capacity and mileage range of EVs just doesn't make sense for them or viable for their business usage. The average range of an EV, Tesla is an exception, is about 150 miles per charge. and it's increasing with each model year. But let me ask you a question. How long do you think the drive is on a typical driving day for most companies? Well, what we found is that many corporate fleets tend to have relatively controlled routes. A British company called Milk and More is a great example. Milk and More delivers milk and groceries, hence the name, to customers around rural England. With an entire fleet of electric vehicles, they average around 80 miles per route. That's an example of what's typical in their world, and it's clearly well within the EV margin for charging error. Okay, need another example? Let me give you one. One of our clients was convinced that their corporate fleet vehicles were used on routes that were too long, and that switching to EVs would not be reasonable. So, we analyzed the data and found that while some of their routes were more than 200 kilometers, more than 125 miles, most of them, 90% of the vehicles only traveled around 95 miles on a typical route. So, most of their fleet could be easily transitioned to electric. And now, after introducing EVs into their fleet of 800 plus vehicles, they're already reducing costs and impacting the environment as they begin their fleet transformation journey. And with the Sustainable Mobility Management platform managing their fleet, they'll be able to plan the next phase of that journey with full visibility to their mobility patterns, no guesswork there. Another part of this EVs aren't realistic myth is that there aren't enough charging stations. I've got 2 words for you. Harley Davidson. Ewan McGregor and Charlie Boorman just took 2 Harley live wires up the entire length of South America to Los Angeles. 13 countries and 13,000 miles, all electric. And they did it with lower mileage range of an e-motorcycle, only about 90 miles per charge. Now, I'm not saying it was simple, but the simple truth they found is the same truth for most corporate fleets. People drive their vehicles home at the end of the day, or they're parked at the company parking lot for the night. Well, guess what's at both of those places? Electricity. A well-planned corporate fleet charging infrastructure will manage both electrical availability and vehicle charging needs. And if employees take their company-owned vehicles home, a sophisticated but easy-to-install solution can bill the electricity consumption back to the company, integrated into the overall energy consumption view for the company. The third big myth is about people driving the vehicles. They're concerned about loss of privacy. Who wouldn't be? Big Brother might be monitoring their every move. Let's look at this because it is really, truly a big emotional hurdle. The value of having telematics, the devices that monitor the vehicle, its location, its battery status, its availability, is in the data. It isn't the data of the individual, it's the data of the vehicle itself. Now, it's not about people, it's about mobility patterns, capacity, demand. But people don't want to feel like they're being tracked. They might not trust their employer to use the data only in the ways that it was intended. Okay, so that's where trust comes in. Companies work with their software and their telematics teams to define specific business practices about what data is collected, what it will be used for, who can see the data. And then they tell their employees those parameters so that everyone is completely informed. Now, the beauty of the telematics is that there are ways to regulate their usage to make the rules very clear. They can be turned off and on at specific times. For example, if you have a company vehicle, it's going to be helpful to have the fleet manager know when it needs service or maintenance. Or if there's an issue, it's great when the company can know about it before it becomes a real problem. But one of the perks of a company vehicle is that it's a car 24/7. Secure telematics can have defined hours or regular connection times that occur only during work hours. So they're not interested in what the driver is doing in their off hours, and that's what the data can reflect. With any kind of consent, people must understand how their data is being used, and then they must trust it's being used appropriately. So we've established that EVs fit most business needs, that they can be more reliable and cheaper to operate than traditional vehicles, and that individual privacy can be preserved. The next question is, how do I get started? Okay, let's talk about that. There are 2 big things you can do to get started. The first thing you do is plan. It really isn't as simple as saying, hey, let's swap out those gas guzzlers with an EV. Yes, the vehicles are important, but you're going to have choices over which vehicles to switch based on lease expiration dates, whether you own them or lease them, the routes that are typically driven, the mileage needs, and many other factors. But you can't have EVs without a charging infrastructure. Smart, fast chargers may cost all in more than $35,000, while a traditional slow-speed charger could cost all in about $4,000, based on general market data. There's also the low-cost at-home corporate charging solution I mentioned earlier. As your EV fleet expands, you're going to need more of these, and you're going to need the facility to house them, access points to plug in your vehicles, and the power capabilities to manage that charging load based on vehicles, charging speed, and battery capacity. One company engaged us during the planning phases of building out their new corporate headquarters. They're looking ahead for what they need from day one, but they also want to be prepared for what could happen down the road. By planning now, today, they'll build in the electric capacity for tomorrow and have the power infrastructure for whatever needs may arise. And they'll be avoiding the huge cost of retrofitting and trying to add charging capacity later. But planning isn't just about fleet electrification. It's also looking at opportunities that come when you begin to see mobility as a transversal element of your corporate story. Transportation touches everything, not just your fleet. As I said at the beginning, transportation is big. Which leads me to the second big thing to do when planning for more sustainable mobility. You must embrace big data. According to a recent overview of the big data space and tech jury, among other very fascinating tidbits of information, is a finding that 90% of all the world's data was created in a 2-year period, beginning around 2015. And IDC predicts that the volume of data generated by all of these great new mobile devices and IoT devices would double every 2 years to about 40 zettabytes in 2020 and a forecast of 165 zettabytes by 2025. The sheer numbers are astounding. But anyone in technology can tell you there is value in data, if you can harness it. By looking at mobility data in one dashboard, you can see much more than usage or availability. Data lets you see things you can't see in the physical, unconnected world. You can see patterns, and patterns can help you identify areas ripe for change and for improvement. You can see, in real time, ways to build efficiencies and create new opportunities. The model for mobility in enterprises and the ecosystems in which they operate will change, especially in urban transportation. The tipping point for EVs is coming. Enterprises can accelerate it. It must be said that businesses can be the driver of change, pun intended. From the way they manage transportation within their business and with their partners, to how they embrace mobility for their employees. Small changes will have profound ripple effects. And the best of all is when transformation is coordinated with other businesses and cities, where they work and where the people and the goods move. Let's say that today, 80% of your employees use a car. With a data-driven approach to mobility, you can create alternative scenarios. Let's say in 5 years, your goal is for 20% for employees to use bicycles to get to work. And you want to introduce an active ride-sharing program to reduce overall vehicle use. You can create a plan that will identify the best approach to reach those goals. That's how companies change the way people move. Because if you're changing the way they get to and from work, you'll also impact how people move within their lives. If I go to work on my bike, I'm going to be more likely to use my bike on other trips. For customers who have instituted their own sustainability goals, you're now a part of the solution with a mobility lens. We are truly at an amazing time in mobility. When you embrace the value and the power of mobility data, you gain resiliency and flexibility, and you'll be able to handle changing conditions. You can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution while you save money, and create better environments for your employees, customers, and all of your trading partners. And you will be changing the way people move for the better. Thank you.